The dying man on the table was the only thing standing between the town of Colton Ridge and complete lawless chaos, and Lucy Garrison knew it. She stood in the doorway of Doc Alderman's makeshift surgery, her leather satchel clutched against her chest, her jaw set with the particular kind of determination that had carried her 1,700 miles from Philadelphia to the Wyoming territory alone. The room smelled of sweat and fever, and something darker beneath it, something rotten and sweet that made her stomach clench with recognition. She had smelled that smell before, in the woods outside Laramie, crouched over a specimen she had pressed between wax paper and cataloged with trembling excitement. She knew what it meant then. She knew what it meant now. Marshal Theodore Keene lay flat on his back on the surgeon's table, his enormous frame barely contained by its edges, his chest rising and falling in shallow, desperate rhythms. His face, which she had only glimpsed twice before, once when he had tipped his hat at her without slowing his horse, and once when he had looked straight through her in the general store as if she were a fixture on the wall, was now the color of old ash. His lips were faintly blue. His hands, which she had heard could break a fence post barehanded, lay open and slack at his sides like something abandoned. Around him stood 3 men who believed they were in charge of saving him. Doc Alderman, 60 years old and increasingly unreliable since his wife had passed, was pressing a poultice of mustard and lard to the marshal's throat. Deputy Carver, who wore his authority the way a child wears an adult's hat, was shouting orders that no one followed. And Pastor Hinz had taken it upon himself to begin a prayer that, by the sound of it, was already being composed in the past tense. Lucy stepped fully into the room. No one looked at her. She had been trying to tell them for 10 minutes. She had knocked on the surgery door and been waved away. She had sent a note in with the barber's boy and watched it fall unread to the floor. She had stood at the window and called through the glass, and Doc Alderman had pulled the curtain shut. She was the frontier naturalist. She was the woman who wandered the plains alone with a magnifying glass and a journal. She was, according to Mrs. Potts at the laundry, a peculiarity. According to Judge Faber, a distraction. According to the territory's one newspaper, a curiosity worth 2 column inches last spring, when she had correctly identified the source of a mysterious illness-killing elk herd south of the Powder River. 2 column inches, and then silence, and then the world going on without her exactly as it had before. But Lucy Garrison had not come 1,700 miles to be silent. She crossed the room in 6 strides, set her satchel on the edge of the table next to Marshal Keene's left boot, and pulled it open. "Get out of here, Miss Garrison." Doc Alderman did not look up. "This is no place for a woman's hobby." "Move your hand," Lucy said, and her voice came out perfectly flat and perfectly certain, the voice she used when she was right and she knew the cost of being ignored. Alderman looked up then, startled by the tone of it. "The mustard poultice," she said, "is making it worse. The rash on his throat is not from an infection. Look at the pattern, look at the edges. They are scalloped, not smooth. That is contact dermatitis from a plant in the genus Toxicodendron, but that is not what is killing him. That is a symptom of where he was. What is killing him is what he ingested." The blue tinge on his lips, the rate of his breathing, the fever pattern that started high and is now dropping rather than climbing. He has been poisoned by water hemlock, Cicuta douglasi, and if someone does not address it in the next 2 hours, the marshal will be dead before sunrise. The room went completely still. Deputy Carver made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Now I have heard everything. Where did you learn that name?" Doc Alderman asked slowly, and there was something in his voice that was not dismissal anymore, something more careful. "From 4 years of field study across 3 territories," Lucy said, 2 published monographs in the Academy of Natural Sciences Journal, and the fact that I found water hemlock growing in the creek bed east of Sutter's Crossing 6 days ago, which is precisely where Marshal Keene was reported to have watered his horse Monday last. She reached into her satchel and pulled out a folded piece of wax paper. Inside it was a pressed specimen, pale and delicate, the leaves finely divided, the stem marked with purple at its base. She set it on the table next to the marshal's hand. "This is what poisoned him," she said, "and I know what will help him. But I need your cooperation, and I need it immediately." This was the moment she had been building toward for 4 years. This was the moment no one had believed was coming. And she stood in the center of it as she had always planned to stand, not asking permission, not apologizing, simply being the most capable person in the room and making sure everyone knew it. What she had not planned for was what happened next. Marshal Theodore Keene, who had not moved in 6 hours, opened his eyes. They were gray, she noticed, the precise gray of storm clouds over the plains in the moment before the lightning, and even dilated with fever and pain, they were arrestingly focused. They found her face immediately, with the instinctive accuracy of a man whose survival had always depended on locating the thing that mattered most in any room. He looked at the pressed specimen on the table beside his hand. He looked back at her face, and in a voice wrecked by fever and barely above a whisper, he said, "Do it. Whatever she says." It was the beginning of everything. But to understand how Lucy Garrison and Theodore Keene arrived at that moment in the surgery on the night of October the 3rd, 1882, you have to go back to the beginning of September, to the day she first arrived in Colton Ridge with her notebooks, her pressed specimens, and the absolute certainty that the Wyoming territory held secrets the rest of the world had not yet thought to ask about. Lucy had come west because the East had run out of room for her. That was the simplest way to say it, though it was not entirely accurate. The more accurate version was that Philadelphia had decided, by the time she was 26, that a woman of her intelligence and her temperament was either going to be a governess or a problem, and she had chosen to be a problem. She had published under the initials L.R. Garrison for 3 years before a colleague at the academy had let slip, in a moment of either honesty or spite, that the L.R. stood for Lucy, and the author was a woman. The journal had not retracted her work. But the invitations to conferences had stopped. The collegial letters had dried up. And when the Academy had announced a funded expedition to catalog the plant life of the Wyoming and Montana territories, they had offered the position to a man named Whitfield who had, as best Lucy could determine, never once left the city of Boston. She had not waited for the offer that was not coming. She had written to the Wyoming Territory's 2 largest newspapers, secured a modest arrangement as a correspondent and field reporter, packed her equipment, her journals, her specimen press, and the one good dress she owned for emergencies she did not anticipate, and she had boarded the train west. Colton Ridge was not her destination so much as the place where her horse had thrown a shoe 3 miles outside of town, and the nearest livery was Colton Ridge's. She had led the horse in on a Tuesday morning in early September, and by the following Monday she had rented the small room above the hardware store, arranged for a monthly fee with the hardware store owner's wife to use their kitchen table for her cataloging work, and decided that Colton Ridge and its surrounding territory was as good a place as any to begin the serious work of documenting what the frontier was made of beneath its surface. She had met in her first week the following people: Doc Alderman, who had looked at her field medical references and said they were charming; Mrs. Potts, who had said her habits were very unusual; Deputy Carver, who had asked if she was waiting for her husband to arrive; Judge Faber, who had told her the territory already had a natural sciences correspondent for the newspaper in Cheyenne; and Pastor Hinz, who had suggested with great kindness that her energies might be better directed toward establishing a Sunday school. She had not met Marshal Theodore Keene that first week, because he was not there. He was, according to the barber's boy who seemed to know everything about everyone in town, tracking a group of cattle thieves through the northern passes. He had been gone for 3 weeks by the time Lucy arrived. He would be back when he was back, and not a moment before, because that was how the marshal did things. She heard about him in fragments, the way you hear a language before you speak it. He was 32 years old. He had come to Colton Ridge 5 years ago from somewhere south, Texas maybe, or New Mexico. No one was entirely certain. He had taken the marshal's position after the previous one had been found to be taking bribes from the very men he was supposed to be arresting, and in his first month he had cleaned up what his predecessor had built up in 3 years. He was not chatty. He was not cruel. He was exactly as hard and as fair as the territory required, and the people of Colton Ridge had built a particular kind of quiet faith in him, the way you build faith in a well-made tool. Not with love exactly, but with the deep relief of something that works. Lucy filed this information in the back of her mind the way she filed everything, carefully, and thought no more about it. She had other things to occupy her. The territory in September was extraordinary. She had not been prepared for the specific quality of light in the Wyoming plains, the way it came down flat and enormous, and turned the grass to something that looked like hammered copper in the late afternoon. She had not been prepared for the scale of the sky, which was so large that standing under it felt less like being outdoors and more like being inside a different kind of room, one with rules she did not yet know. And she had not been prepared for the plants, the astonishing, varied, endlessly surprising inventory of what grew in the soil of the frontier. She found specimens she had only read about in her first 3 days. She found things she had never read about at all. She cataloged with the particular joy of a person doing precisely the thing they were built for, alone on the plains with her press and her jars and her magnifying glass, the sun on her shoulders and the wind in her hair, and the whole living world spread open around her like a book written in a language she had spent her whole life learning to read. She was out near the creek bed east of Sutter's Crossing on a cool morning in late September when she found the water hemlock. She recognized it immediately, with the same cold clarity with which you recognize something beautiful that is also dangerous. The white umbels of flowers, the distinctive purple banding at the base of the hollow stems, the particular sweetness of the smell, a smell that had no business being attached to something so lethal. She crouched beside it for a long time, cataloging, pressing, noting the location with precision in her journal. She marked it in the margin with a double red line, her private notation for plants that required particular caution. She made a note to mention it to Doc Alderman. She made the note and then she forgot it, because by the time she rode back into Colton Ridge that evening, there were 3 different things competing for her attention. A letter from the Philadelphia correspondent asking for her next submission, a dispute between Mrs. Potts and the hardware store owner's wife that had somehow involved Lucy's rental agreement, and the arrival in town of Marshal Theodore Keene. She did not know it was him at first. She only registered a figure on horseback coming down the main street as she was tying her own horse to the rail outside the hardware store, a large man on a big roan gelding, dust-coated from the road, riding with the particular economy of motion that belonged to people who had spent so many hours in the saddle that they had ceased to think about it. He wore a dark hat pulled low and a canvas duster the color of the road, and there was a rifle in the scabbard on his saddle and a badge pinned to his shirt that caught the last light. He passed without looking at her, which was nothing new. Half the town passed without looking at her. She learned his name from the barber's boy 20 minutes later. She tucked it away with the rest of her information and went upstairs to write her letters. She saw him twice more in the following week, briefly, the way you see furniture in a room you are passing through. He was there and he was real and he was the marshal, and those were the relevant facts. The way his jaw was set, the particular weight of his presence when he walked through a room, the way the air seemed to know he was in it. These were observations, not feelings. Lucy Garrison was excellent at making observations and very careful about feelings. She had been careful about feelings for a specific reason that lived in her chest like a small, sharp stone. His name had been Jeffrey Marsh, and he had been a fellow at the academy, and for 8 months she had believed with her whole heart that he saw her the same way she saw herself, not as a woman to be managed, but as a mind to be reckoned with. And then the evening she had shown him the draft of what would become her second published monograph. He had read the first 3 pages and said, very gently, very kindly, that it was impressive for a woman to have such enthusiasm, and that he would be happy to submit it for her under his own name to save her the embarrassment of rejection. She had taken the monograph back. She had submitted it under her own initials, and she had added Jeffrey Marsh to the careful internal list of people whose opinion she did not require, a list which had grown long enough that she had stopped keeping it and simply decided, somewhere around the middle of it, to need no one. This was the woman who stood in the surgery on the night of October the 3rd, 1882, watching Marshal Theodore Keene open his eyes and say, in that wrecked whisper, "Do whatever she says." And then, because he had said it and because he was the marshal, and because the particular authority he carried was apparently operational even at the threshold of death, Doc Alderman stepped back and looked at Lucy properly for the first time since she had entered the room and said, "What do you need?" she told him. "Water hemlock poisoning," she explained as she moved with practiced efficiency through her satchel, operated through the toxin cicutoxin, which triggered violent convulsions, cardiac irregularities, and respiratory depression. The primary concern now, given that the marshal had clearly been exposed some time ago and had already passed through the convulsive phase, was the secondary shutdown of the respiratory and cardiac systems, which could be addressed through several means. She needed activated charcoal if they had it, which they might in the form of charred wood. She needed milk, which would bind to the toxins in the gastrointestinal tract. She needed to establish his breathing and temperature, and she needed the room quiet enough to do all of this properly. "I also need someone to ride to the creek east of Sutter's Crossing before full dark," she said, without looking up from the marshal's pulse point, which she was measuring with 2 fingers and her pocket watch. "There is a stand of marsh elder on the north bank. The leaves, dried and made into a tea, will support the cardiac function. I have some dried in my satchel, but not enough for a full course of treatment." "Who's going to ride out there?" Deputy Carver said. "Someone who knows where Sutter's Crossing is and owns a horse," Lucy said. "I presume that describes several people in this building." There was a silence. Then the barber's boy, who had apparently been in the corner this entire time, and who Lucy decided immediately was the most practically useful person in the room, said that he would go, and named a man who lived near the crossing who could show him the right plant if Miss Garrison would describe it. Lucy described it in 30 seconds, gave him the wax paper pressing from her satchel to compare against, and sent him out the door. She worked through the night. It was not the first time she had worked through a night. In her field work she had stayed awake in the open plains watching animal patterns and plant behaviors and the particular drama of the frontier sky, and she had stayed awake in her rented room writing and cataloging by lamplight until her eyes burned. But this was different. This was a man's life under her hands, and she was acutely aware of every decision she made, the dosage of the charcoal, the temperature of the milk tea, the intervals at which she turned him to prevent the lungs from filling, the precise moment at which his color began, infinitely slowly, to shift from ash toward something closer to living. Doc Alderman helped her. He was a better man than his habits suggested, she realized, as the night wore on. He had simply been practicing medicine with outdated information in an isolated territory, which was a different kind of problem from incompetence. He asked questions. He watched her hands. He made notes in his own journal in a cramped, careful handwriting that told her he took the information seriously. The marshal came and went from consciousness like someone moving through different rooms of a house, present for a few minutes and then somewhere else entirely, and then present again. When he was conscious, he was surprisingly quiet about his own condition. He did not protest when she turned him or tilted him or pressed the cup to his lips. He watched her work with those storm-gray eyes, and she got the feeling, without being able to entirely explain it, that he was filing her away the same way she filed things, carefully, and with the particular attention reserved for things that mattered. At 2 in the morning, when his breathing had stabilized enough that she allowed herself to sit down in the chair beside the table, he turned his head toward her and said, in a voice that was still rough but considerably more present than it had been, "You found the hemlock by the creek." It was not a question. 6 days ago, she said. "I should have warned the town. I noted it and then I let other things crowd it out. That is a failure I intend to hold myself accountable for." He was quiet for a moment. "I watered my horse there Monday." "I know." Another silence. "How did you know what it was?" "Because I have spent 4 years learning exactly what grows in this territory and what it does to the things that eat it," she said. "That is my work." "Your work," he repeated, as if the word had a texture he was feeling for. "Not your hobby." She looked at him directly. "No, not my hobby." He held her gaze for a moment that stretched just slightly beyond the comfortable, and then he closed his eyes again. "Thank you, Miss Garrison," he said. "You are welcome, Marshal Keene," she said, and she turned back to her notes and did not think about the quality of that gaze or the way her name sounded in his wrecked, quiet voice. Because she was a woman who did not have feelings. She had observations, and it was important to keep those two categories properly separate. She maintained this position with considerable discipline until approximately dawn. The barber's boy came back with the marsh elder just after 4 in the morning, brought by a weather-beaten man from near Sutter's Crossing who confirmed, in vivid and slightly alarmed language, that yes, that plant grew all along that creek bank, and he had never known it could do such a thing. Lucy thanked him, prepared the first infusion, and sat with the marshal through the slow gray arrival of morning, monitoring his vital signs and updating her notes and not, under any circumstances, thinking about the moment he had opened his eyes and chosen to trust her without any evidence that she deserved it. By the time the sun was fully up, Theodore Keene's color had returned to something that resembled health. His breathing was deep and even. His fever had broken in the last hour before dawn, leaving his dark hair damp at the temples and his shirt clinging to him in a way that Lucy had noted clinically, and then immediately decided not to look at again. Doc Alderman came in at 7, looked at his patient, looked at Lucy, and made a sound in his throat that contained more admission than he probably intended. "Well," he said, "he will need 3 more days of the marsh elder infusion," Lucy said, "and he should not be riding for at least a week." His heart took considerable strain. "Yes," Alderman said, "I can see that." He looked at her for another moment. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You owe him his life," Lucy said. "That is sufficient." She gathered her satchel, checked her notes one more time, and went home to sleep. She slept for 4 hours. Then she wrote up her account of the water hemlock case in full, with botanical descriptions and treatment protocols in the format of an article for the Philadelphia Journal. Then she ate breakfast and went back to the surgery to check on her patient. The surgery was considerably more crowded than it had been in the night. Half the town seemed to have found reasons to be in or near the building. Word had traveled in the particular rapid way that small frontier towns transmit information, which is to say that everyone knew everything by the time Lucy arrived, and the shift in the way they looked at her when she walked down the main street was so abrupt that she almost stopped in her tracks from the strangeness of it. Mrs. Potts said good morning to her first, and with actual warmth. The hardware store owner himself held the door open and thanked her without being asked for what she had done. Judge Faber, passing on the other side of the street, lifted his hat to her. Lucy kept walking, because she had work to do and because she was not sure yet what to do with the sudden reversal. She had been invisible for a month, now she was not. The change did not feel as satisfying as she had imagined it would feel during the many hours she had spent being invisible. It felt more complicated than that. It felt like something she would have to think about carefully later when there was time. The marshal was sitting up when she came in. He should not have been sitting up, she said so immediately. "I heal fast," he said. "You are not a horse," she said. "Sit back down." He sat back down, with the particular expression of a man who is accustomed to being the final authority in a room and finds the experience of being overruled genuinely novel. Not unpleasant, she noticed. Just novel. She took his pulse. She checked his color. She asked him a series of questions about his symptoms that he answered with concise, accurate answers, which surprised her until she remembered that a man who survived in the frontier for any length of time had to be his own doctor more often than not. The Marsh Elder infusion, she said, when she had completed her assessment and written her notes. Twice a day until Saturday. Doc Alderman can prepare it. I will write down the proportions. And after Saturday, he said, after Saturday, if you have not undone my work by getting out of bed before you should, your heart should be well enough for light activity. Light. Not chasing cattle thieves through passes. The cattle thieves will need to know that, he said. It was, she realized, a joke. Not a booming, obvious joke, but a dry, quiet one delivered with perfect stillness. She found herself on the very edge of smiling and redirected it into her notes. I need to ask you something, he said after a moment. All right, she said. Why did you keep trying when Alderman turned you away, when Carver told you to leave? You could have walked away and let us get on with killing me. She looked up from her notes. He was watching her with that direct gray gaze that she was beginning to recognize as simply the way he looked at things, fully and without evasion. Because I knew I was right, she said, and because you were dying. Those two things together did not leave room for walking away. He was quiet for a moment. Most people, he said, would rather be told they're right than do the difficult thing. I know, she said. I am not most people. He held her gaze again, that extra beat, that slightly too long regard that she was cataloging with the part of herself she was not supposed to be using. No, he said. I can see that. She went home. She wrote 3 letters. 2 of them professional, and one of which she crumpled up and threw in the waste bin before it was halfway done. Because she had begun to describe the quality of a man's eyes in clinical language, and had caught herself, and recognized that clinical language was not what she was reaching for, which was information she did not want to have. She went back the next day, because she had committed to monitoring his recovery, and she was a woman who kept her commitments. He was sitting up again when she arrived. This time she let it pass because his color was genuinely improved and the infusion was clearly working, and she had the feeling that telling him to lie down was going to be an ongoing negotiation she could not win. Tell me about the water hemlock, he said when she had finished her assessment. I beg your pardon. You know about it. I would like to know about it too, in case I come across it again. She studied him for a moment. He looked serious. He was looking at her the way, she realized. She looked at the things she wanted to understand, with full attention and actual interest and no performance of politeness. She told him about Cicuta Douglasi, about the characteristic purple banding and the chambered roots and the smell that was deceptively pleasant and the reason it grew along creek banks, and why livestock and horses were particularly vulnerable. She told him about the broader family it belonged to, the Apiaceae, and the members of that family that were edible and the ones that were lethal and the ways to tell them apart, which were real and learnable and not a matter of luck. He listened without interrupting, without checking whether she had finished, without offering an opinion about something she had not asked him to opine on. When she was done, he asked 2 questions that were intelligent enough that she answered them at more length than she had planned. You know, he said, when they had been talking for nearly an hour, my deputy thinks you guessed. Your deputy, she said, is welcome to verify the results. He's welcome to try to argue with them, Keene said. I find that the results tend to settle the argument. They do, she agreed. He smiled then, not the shallow performance of a smile that people produced when they wanted to seem agreeable, but an actual smile, brief and real, that changed his face from formidable to something considerably more dangerous, and she identified the particular quality of danger immediately, which was the danger of wanting to see it again. She went home and wrote in her personal journal, which she kept separate from her professional notebooks, for the first time in 3 weeks. She did not write about what she had written about. She closed the journal, put it in her satchel, and went to bed. By the 3rd day of his recovery, They had fallen into a pattern that she noticed but did not examine, which was that she came at 10 in the morning and stayed until noon, and they talked for most of those 2 hours about whatever she had found or observed or cataloged the previous day. And he listened and asked questions, and occasionally told her something about the territory that she did not know, which was rarer than she expected because she had done her reading, but which happened with enough frequency to indicate that he knew things that books did not contain. He knew which trails flooded in early spring and which held true all year. He knew where the elk had shifted their range and why, and his reasoning was ecological in ways she found genuinely satisfying. He knew the names the Shoshone used for the plants in the northern passes, and when she asked him how he knew them, he said he had spent 2 winters in the company of a Shoshone man named Broken Feather, who had been the wisest person he had encountered in the territory, and had been dead these past 2 years from the influenza, which was a loss the territory had not properly mourned because it had not properly understood what it had. "He taught you plant names," she said. "He taught me how to be in this country instead of just on top of it," Keene said. The plants were part of that. She wrote that in her personal journal that evening. She was beginning to understand that the personal journal was becoming a record of a different kind of observation than she had intended. He was allowed out of bed by Thursday, with restrictions she had negotiated down from her original position after he had, with remarkable patience, explained that there were 3 outstanding matters of law enforcement in the territory that could not wait the full week she had prescribed, and she had revised her prescription to accommodate the realities of his work without compromising his recovery, and he had accepted the revision without argument, and this exchange had felt, she noted privately, very much like a collaboration between 2 people who took each other's expertise seriously, which was not an experience she had a great deal of prior familiarity with. He was in the surgery for the last time on Saturday morning, when she arrived to assess him before releasing him from her medical oversight. She found him standing by the window, fully dressed, hat in hand, and she conducted her assessment with the briskness of a professional who was not thinking about the fact that she would no longer have a reason to appear at this particular building every morning, because that thought was not relevant to his recovery, and she had no business having it. "All clear," she said, closing her notebook. "Heart rate is strong, color is good, you can resume your duties, light duties." "Understood," he said, and then, "Miss Garrison," she looked up. "I want to thank you properly," he said. "Not the way I thanked you the other night when I was half out of my mind with fever, properly." "You do not need to," she said. "I know I don't need to," he said. "I want to," she waited. "You saved my life," he said. "And you did it after 3 different men in this town told you to go away and mind your business, and you didn't go. And I want you to know that I am aware of what that cost and what it required, and I am not going to forget it." She looked at him for a long moment. "It required nothing more than being certain of what I knew," she said. "The difficulty was other people's certainty about what I was." His jaw tightened slightly. "Yes," he said, "I'm aware of that too." She nodded and picked up her satchel, because she was a woman who knew when a conversation had reached its natural end, and because if she stayed in this room for another 30 seconds she was going to say something that did not belong to the category of professional gratitude. "Marshal," she said at the door. "Yes," he said. "If you water your horse anywhere in the territory and you smell something sweet and pleasant that you did not expect, don't let the horse drink there," she said. "And come find me before you drink anything yourself." She left before she could see whether that made him smile, because she had already established that his smile was something she could not afford to need. She threw herself back into her work with the particular ferocity she used whenever she needed to stop thinking about something. The territory was abundant and demanding, and she cataloged it with the focused attention of a woman who had chosen her work as her life's companion and intended to treat it accordingly. She found 3 new specimens in the first week after the marshal's release, including one she was nearly certain had not been documented in the scientific literature, a small ground-hugging plant with silver leaves, and a root structure unlike anything she had pressed before. She prepared an initial description and sent it to the Philadelphia Journal with a cover letter that was, she considered, appropriately confident without being excessive. She was beginning to find her footing in Colton Ridge in a different way now. The town had not, overnight, become a community of naturalists or progressives. Mrs. Potts still thought her habits were unusual. Deputy Carver still looked at her, as if her continued presence in the territory was a question he had not resolved. But there was a different quality to it now, a kind of cautious respect that expressed itself in small, practical ways, in being included in conversations at the general store rather than talked over, in people actually reading the articles she left copies of on the counter at the post office, in Doc Alderman asking her, on 2 separate occasions, to look at a plant specimen he had found and tell him whether it had medicinal properties. She was building something. She was doing it alone, as she had always expected to, and it was enough. She reminded herself that it was enough several times a week, and then on a Tuesday in mid-October, Marshal Theodore Keene walked into the hardware store while she was at the table, cataloging the silver-leaved specimen, and asked if she would show him where she had found the water hemlock. She set down her pen. "Why?" "Because I ride through that country and I need to know what I am looking for," he said. "And because you are the person who knows." She studied him. He was fully recovered now, the color back in his face, the particular solid authority of his presence restored, and he was standing in the hardware store owner's kitchen looking at her silver-leaved specimen with what appeared to be genuine curiosity. "All right," she said. "Tomorrow morning, 6 o'clock. Bring water for yourself and I will bring my kit, and we will make a proper morning of it." He agreed, said good morning to the hardware store owner's wife, who turned slightly pink at the courtesy, and left. Lucy Garrison sat for a while after he had gone, thinking about the difference between a professional engagement and a personal one, and whether riding out to a creek bed at 6 in the morning, with a man whose company you had been deliberately not seeking, was one or the other or both, and arriving at the unhelpful conclusion that it was probably both, and that she intended to go anyway. The morning was brilliant and cold, the sky vast and clear in the way it got in October, when the air had a crystalline quality that made everything look slightly more real than usual. They rode east at a comfortable pace, not rushing, the horses settling into an easy rhythm on the trail, and Lucy was struck, not for the first time and in a way she was having increasing difficulty categorizing as merely observational, by how well Theodore Keene sat a horse. Not showily, just with the perfect, economical ease of someone completely at home in themselves. She showed him the water hemlock stand. He crouched beside it the way she crouched beside things she was learning, close and attentive, and she walked him through the identifying features with the same thoroughness she had used in the surgery, because a mistake out here in the field was final, and he listened with the same focused, unperformative attention she had come to understand as simply the way he engaged with things that mattered to him. "And this," she said, moving a few steps along the bank, "is the marsh elder that helped you. See the difference in the leaf shape. Completely different family, completely different properties, but they grow in similar habitats, which is why you need to know them both." "What else grows here?" he said. She spent an hour on that creek bank showing him things. He asked questions, good questions, questions that indicated he was building a framework for understanding the landscape that incorporated this new information the way you add a new tool to a kit you are already competent with. She noticed that he remembered the names she gave him after the first time, which was rarer than it should have been. They were riding back toward town in the late morning, the sun well up now and the plains copper and gold around them, when he said, "I heard you have published work." "2 monographs," she said, "and a number of shorter articles. Under your own name." "Under my initials," she said, and let the history of that choice live in the space after the words, where he could hear it or not as he chose. He heard it. She could tell from the way his jaw moved. "That should not be the case," he said. "No," she agreed. "It should not." "Are you going to change it?" She thought about it for a moment. I have been considering it, she said, publishing the water hemlock case under my full name. It is a significant enough finding that it might have a better chance of standing on its own than a piece about the flowering cycle of high-altitude grasses. It will stand, he said. It has already stood. It kept a man alive. She looked at the trail ahead of her. Yes, she said, it did. There was a comfortable silence between them, the kind that only exists between people who have stopped needing to fill it with performance, and Lucy recognized it and felt the recognition with the particular alarm of someone who has spent 4 years building walls that were apparently less structural than she had believed. I want to show you something, she said, before she had entirely decided to say it. She turned her horse off the trail onto a lesser track she had discovered 3 weeks ago, and he followed without asking why, which she noted. The track led through a stand of cottonwood, their leaves turning gold in the October light and up a slight rise, and then opened onto a stretch of higher ground where, in the gap between 2 ridges, you could see the whole plain spread below you and the mountains behind, the Absaroka Range purple and snow-capped in the distance, the whole enormous quiet of the territory laid out like a map of the world made fresh. She stopped her horse. He stopped beside her. My word, he said, very quietly. I found it 3 weeks ago, she said. I have not shown it to anyone. He was quiet for a long moment. He was looking at the mountains the way she had looked at them when she found this place, with the recognition of something that demands the entire self, not just the eyes. Why did you show it to me? He said. She thought about several answers and gave him the true one. Because I thought you would understand what it was. He turned on his horse so he was facing her, and he looked at her the way he had looked at the territory, with full and unguarded attention. And she felt it somewhere deep in her chest, that look. Felt it the way you feel a change in pressure before a storm, the warning and the anticipation combined. Lucy, he said, and her first name in his voice was something she had not been prepared for. Marshal, she said automatically. Theodore, he said, or Theo if that's easier. I think we have passed the point where Marshal and Miss Garrison are accurate. She looked at him for a long moment, sitting her horse on that high ground with the mountains behind him, and the October light doing things to the planes of his face that she was not going to write down in any notebook. Theo, she said, and the word felt like a small, particular decision, the kind whose weight you feel after you make it, not before. He smiled. The real smile, the one she had been trying not to need. It was every bit as dangerous as she had established. They rode back to town and parted at the livery with a courtesy that was careful on both sides and meant something slightly different on both sides because of it. Over the following 2 weeks, things developed with the particular slow speed of something that is happening too certainly to rush. He came to find her twice at the hardware store, once with a plant specimen he had found on the trail that he wanted her to identify, which she did, and once with a question about a creek near the northern pass that he was planning to ride through, whether she knew what grew there and whether any of it was dangerous. She answered both questions, and they ended up talking for an hour each time about things that were not, strictly speaking, botanical. She joined him for supper at the one restaurant in Colton Ridge on a Thursday evening, which was noted by everyone in the restaurant and discussed across town by the following morning, and she decided she did not care, which was itself information about where she had arrived in relation to this situation. He listened when she talked about her work. He listened not in the way that people listened when they were being polite, but in the way that people listened when they were genuinely constructing understanding. And she found, progressively, that she was reaching for his opinion on things she had previously only asked her own judgment about, and that his opinion was worth having, that he was perceptive in ways that were different from her ways and usefully so, and that the combination of his knowledge of the territory's human landscape and her knowledge of its natural one made both of them considerably better informed than either had been alone. She was developing, she noted with a kind of internal honesty she had grown into slowly, feelings. She had spent 4 years deciding she did not have feelings, which she now recognized as not quite the same thing as not having them. She had buried them in work and in motion, and in the long, clean discipline of scientific inquiry, and they had stayed buried because she had never met anyone who addressed them in any way she recognized as valid. And now there was this man, this quiet, serious, powerful man who had looked at her pressed specimen in the surgery and said, "Do whatever she says." And the feelings were definitively not buried anymore. They were present and specific, and she was going to have to decide what to do about them. She was turning this over in her mind on a Sunday afternoon in late October, sitting on the step of the hardware store with her notebook on her knee and her pen idle, when Deputy Carver stopped in front of her. He had never quite abandoned his initial position on her, which was that she was an anomaly requiring monitoring. He stood in front of her now with the look of a man who has decided to be direct in a way he knows will not be welcome. "Miss Garrison," he said. "Deputy," she said, "I want to say something to you, and I'd ask you to take it in the spirit it's intended." "I will do my best," she said. "The Marshal is a serious man," Carver said. "He doesn't go in for social entertainments. He hasn't shown the kind of attention he's been showing you to any woman in the 5 years I've known him. And I think you should consider what that means and whether you are in a position to meet it." She looked at him steadily. "Are you warning me to be careful of him, or warning me to be careful of disappointing him?" Carver hesitated. "Both, I suppose." "Then I thank you for the honesty," she said, "and I will tell you that I have been capable of determining what I am in a position to meet for my entire adult life without assistance, and that I extend Marshal Keene the same respect I extend anyone else, which is to take him seriously and be honest with him and not treat him as a problem to be managed. Is that sufficient?" Carver was quiet for a moment. Then, to his considerable credit, he said, "I suppose it is." He left. She sat on the step for another 10 minutes, not writing, and then she made a decision. She found Theodore Keene at the end of the day as he was locking up the marshal's office. The evening was cold, the sky already going dark at 5 o'clock in the way it did in the Wyoming territory in October, the first stars coming out with a clarity that always made her want to stay outside longer than was sensible. "I need to tell you something," she said. "All right," he said, and turned toward her with the particular attentiveness she had come to know as his version of interest. "I came to this territory alone, and I intended to remain alone," she said. "I had very good reasons for that, which I am not going to explain in detail because they are in the past, and the past is less interesting to me than what I am looking at right now." His expression did not change, but his eyes did something that she had catalogued as his version of intensity. "What I am looking at right now," she continued, "is that I have spent the last 3 weeks in your company more than I have spent in anyone else's company in 4 years, and that I find myself consulting your judgment and seeking your perspective, and being interested in your opinion on things I have never previously sought a second opinion on. And I want you to know that I am aware of what that means, and that I am not frightened of it, but I am also not going to pretend it isn't happening, because I am a scientist, and a pretending scientist is no scientist at all." He was completely still for a moment. Then he said, "That is the most extraordinary thing anyone has ever said to me." "Is it accurate," she said, "that you want to be with me?" he said. "That I am finding myself in that direction," she said, "with the caveat that I am not a woman who disappears into anyone's life. I have my own work and my own mind and my own path, and those things are not negotiable. And if you need a woman who makes you the center of her world, I am not that woman." "I don't need that," he said, quietly and without hesitation. "Then we understand each other," she said. "Lucy," he said, and stepped closer, and this time when he said her name it was not a statement but an approach, an arrival. "I have been careful all my life about what I let matter to me, because the things that matter to you are the things that can be taken. And I have been working very hard, since a certain Sunday morning 6 weeks ago when I came back into this town, and saw a woman I didn't know tying her horse to the rail outside the hardware store with the air of a person who has arrived somewhere and intends to stay, to be careful about you specifically. She looked up at him. "And are you still being careful?" "Less and less," he said. He took her hand, which was a gesture so simple and so deliberate that she felt it travel from where his fingers closed around hers all the way up through her arm and into her chest, where the small, sharp stone of her old caution sat, and she felt it dissolve. Not shatter. Dissolve the way something solid dissolves in the right kind of solvent, quietly and completely. "Walk with me," he said. They walked along the main street as the evening came fully down, and the lamps came on in the buildings, and the sky overhead went from deep blue to black and filled with the enormous indifferent splendor of the frontier stars, and they talked, and did not talk, and at a certain point his arm was around her shoulders and she was very close to his side, which was warm and solid and smelled of the road, and the cold air, and something she did not have a scientific name for. When he walked her back to the hardware store, he stood for a moment at the foot of the steps, and she stood on the second step so that their heights were level, and he looked at her with the full, storm-gray openness of that gaze. "I am not a man who manages well with halfway," he said. "I want you to know that from the start." "I am not a woman who manages well with halfway either," she said. "That is one more thing we have in common." He kissed her then, carefully and completely, and she let herself be kissed and kissed him back with the particular precision and thoroughness she brought to everything she did. And she was aware, somewhere in the back of her mind that was always cataloging, that this was the best thing she had done in a very long time. The weeks that followed were the kind that get written into the personal journal and then live in the memory more vividly than anything written down. They were together in the way of two people who are building something real and know it and take it seriously. He rode out with her on her field expeditions whenever his duties allowed, and she went once with him to the northern pass where he had business, and they covered the ground together, and she catalogued what she found, and he read her notes in the evenings with the focused attention he gave everything, and sometimes offered observations that made their way into the final text. He showed her the territory in a different register than she had been seeing it, the human geography of it, the invisible lines of where different communities had claims, and where those claims were honored, and where they were not. And she found this knowledge necessary to her own understanding in ways she had not anticipated. She had been studying the land without fully accounting for the fact that the land was inhabited, had been inhabited, and that the injustice of what had been taken from people who knew the land long before any naturalist arrived with a specimen press was not separate from the natural history she was recording but woven through it. She wrote about this in one of her articles, plainly and without evasion, and it was the most controversial thing she had published in the territory, and she did not retract a word of it. Theodore read it and said it was true and that he was glad she had written it. She looked at him across the hardware store table and thought that she loved him, clearly and without qualification, and that this was both terrifying and entirely correct, the way a right answer is correct, not because it is comfortable but because it is true. She did not say it yet. She was a scientist. She was building toward a conclusion. In November, a situation developed that put both their capacities to the test in a way that had nothing to do with plants or law enforcement and everything to do with character. A family came through Colton Ridge on a wagon heading north. A father, a mother, and 3 children, one of whom had a fever that Doc Alderman could not account for. Lucy looked at the child, looked at the route they had traveled, asked a series of questions about what the children had eaten and touched and played with along the way, and identified a probable exposure to a combination of plants that, together, were producing the symptoms. She and Theodore sat up that night with the family, she managing the treatment and he managing the family, explaining what was happening in language that was plain and reassuring, sitting with the father in the cold outside the surgery while the mother was inside with the child, talking him through the long wait with the patient steadiness that was one of the things about Theodore Keene that she loved most fiercely. The child recovered by morning. The family continued north with instructions from Lucy, written out in full, about what plants to watch for along the way. When the wagon was gone and they were standing in the quiet of the morning street, Lucy said, "You were very good with that father last night." "He was frightened," Theodore said. "There is not much you can do for someone who is frightened except be with them." "That is a very specific kind of wisdom," she said. He looked at her. "My father was sick when I was young, for a long time. My mother spent those years doing what needed to be done, and the thing that needed to be done more than anything else was someone staying with him while she could not. I learned the usefulness of it." She had not heard him mention his family before. She absorbed the information with the care it deserved. "Is he still alive?" she asked. "No," he said. "He died when I was 16. It was a good death eventually. It took too long to get there, but it was good at the end." He looked at the empty road where the wagon had gone. "I have been avoiding anything that required me to sit with fear like that since then. And now," she said, he looked at her, "and now I think the avoidance has cost me more than the thing I was avoiding." She took his hand, which she had begun to do with the naturalness of something long established, and they stood in the November morning together, which was very cold and very bright and very good. She said it on a Sunday in late November. They were at the high place she had shown him, the gap in the ridges where you could see the whole plain, and it was late afternoon, the light going golden and enormous over the mountains, and the first snow of the season had dusted the higher peaks so that the Absarokas looked like something from a painting of the world before it had been lived in. "I love you," she said. She said it the way she said everything that mattered, directly and without apology. He turned to look at her, and his face in the late light was the most open she had ever seen it, the careful guard down in a way she suspected very few people had seen. "I know," he said. "I have been watching you know it for a while now." He paused. "I love you too. I have been trying to find the right moment, and then I decided there probably is no right moment for something this important. There is just the moment you choose." "This one seems adequate," she said. "It does," he said. He kissed her there with the mountains behind them, and the light going down and the enormous sky overhead. And Lucy Garrison, who had come 1,700 miles to find what the frontier was made of, felt that she had finally found the answer to the question she had not known she was asking. They were married in March of 1883 in the small church in Colton Ridge, in a ceremony that was simple and practical because they were both simple and practical people in matters of form, though not in matters of substance. Lucy wore her one good dress, which turned out to be entirely adequate for the occasion. Theodore wore his best shirt and his hat, which he removed at the door. Doc Alderman stood up with Theodore, having become, over the winter, something close to a friend. Mrs. Potts cried, which surprised everyone including Mrs. Potts. Pastor Hinz, who had in September suggested that Lucy redirect her energies toward Sunday school, performed the ceremony with a warmth and sincerity that she appreciated and matched with her own sincerity, because she had found, over the winter, that holding grudges required energy she preferred to spend on other things. They moved into the small house at the east end of the main street that Theodore had occupied alone since coming to Colton Ridge, and which benefited enormously from the addition of Lucy's specimen presses and notebooks and the general organized clutter of a working scientist, as well as certain practical improvements she made to the kitchen and the storage room that she had been planning since she first saw the house in December. She continued her work. This was not in question. Theodore had never once suggested it might be, which was one of the many reasons she had married him. She continued her field expeditions, continued her publications, and in the spring of 1883 the Philadelphia Journal received and accepted, for the first time, a submission from Lucy R. Garrison, with the name written in full and without apology. She received a letter of acceptance from the journal's new editor, a younger man who had replaced the previous one in the fall, who wrote that her work on Cicuta douglasa and its treatment was the most significant contribution they had received that year, and that he hoped she would consider them a regular venue for her future findings. She read the letter twice, quietly, at the kitchen table. Then she went to find Theodore, who was in the marshal's office across the street, and she handed it to him without a word. He read it, and his face did the thing she had come to understand as his version of joy, which was not loud or demonstrative but was completely real. He handed it back. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have known since the night you stood in that surgery that you were going to change things. I did not know how many things or for how many people, but I knew." She folded the letter and put it in her inside pocket next to her heart. "You knew it before I did," she said. "You knew," he said. "You just needed someone to agree with you." She looked at him with the full weight of everything she felt. "That is possibly the most accurate thing anyone has ever said to me." Summer came to the Wyoming territory in the particular explosive way it had, as if the whole landscape had been storing up green for 6 months and released it all at once. Lucy's catalog grew. She identified the silver-leaved plant definitively as an undescribed species in the spring, and the Philadelphia Journal published her full description in June with a hand-drawn illustration she had made herself. And the species was entered into the scientific record under the name she proposed, a name that honored the creek near which she had found it, and which would stand in the record permanently and without the need for initials. Theodore's duties continued to require him across the territory, and there were weeks when he was on the trail and she was alone in the house, and she found that she did not mind the solitude the way she had minded it before. Not because she needed it less, but because it meant something different now. The choice of a woman who was loved and who returned home to something, rather than the condition of a woman who had decided that home was the wrong category for her life. She found in September of 1883, exactly 1 year after she had come to Colton Ridge, that she was expecting their first child. She calculated the dates and confirmed the information with Doc Alderman, who confirmed it with the particular warmth of a man who feels himself to be, in some small way, implicated in the happiness of the outcome. She told Theodore on a September evening, at the high place with the view of the mountains, because it seemed to her the right place for significant information, the place where the scale of things put everything in proper proportion. He went very still when she told him, the way he went still when something mattered completely. Then he gathered her to him with a care that was so precisely calibrated to what she needed, neither overwhelming nor insufficient, that she felt it as a piece of ongoing evidence for the accuracy of her original assessment of him, which was that he was someone worth trusting. "Are you frightened?" he said into her hair. "A little," she said. "Are you?" "Yes," he said. "A lot, actually." "Good," she said. "That means we both understand what it means." He laughed low and real, the laugh she loved because it was never performed. "Only you would find comfort in mutual fear." "I find comfort in honesty," she said, "which I have told you before." "You have," he said. "I should have it memorized by now." Their son was born in April of 1884, 3 weeks early and in a considerable hurry, and Doc Alderman delivered him with the competence of a man who had learned from the best available source this past year and a half how to be more careful about what he knew and did not know. He was a healthy boy, loud and specific in his opinions from the first hour, with his father's gray eyes and his mother's complete indifference to being ignored. They named him James Broken Feather Keene, the first name for Theodore's father, the second in honor of the Shoshone man whose knowledge of the territory had shaped the man who had shaped this family. Lucy had proposed the second name, and Theodore had been so still for a moment that she thought she had overstepped. And then he had said, with the particular quality she had learned to identify as deep feeling, that it was the most fitting thing he had heard, and that he was grateful. Colton Ridge received little James with the enthusiasm of a frontier town that knew it was watching the future arrive. Mrs. Potts organized a celebration. Doc Alderman made a gift of his most current medical reference text, annotated in the margins with Lucy's improvements, which was both practical and, she considered, the most fitting gift she could have received. Deputy Carver, who had come some considerable distance in his estimation of Lucy Garrison Keene over the past year and a half, stood at the edge of the gathering with an expression that she recognized as a man deciding to say something he had been thinking about for a while. "You did good," he said, when he caught her alone for a moment. "Thank you, Deputy," she said. "I mean all of it," he said, with the careful honesty of a man who does not have a great deal of practice with compliments but is trying. "Not just the boy, all of it. The way you came here and held your ground and made us all pay attention." He paused. "The Marshal is a better man for knowing you. And I think this town is a better town for the same reason." She looked at him for a moment. "That is a very generous thing to say." "It is the truth," he said. "I have been wrong about enough things in my life to know when I should say so." She shook his hand, which surprised him, and thanked him and went back to her son. Theodore found her a little later, standing at the edge of the gathering with James in her arms, looking at the territory as it went gold and open in the afternoon light. He stood beside her, his hand at the small of her back, and they both looked at the plains together, the enormous, ungoverned, astonishing country that had brought her here and kept her here and that their son would grow up knowing. "What are you thinking?" he said. "That it is going to take another 30 years to properly catalog what is growing out there," she said, "and that I am looking forward to it." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Then we had better stay busy," he said. James made a sound that indicated he agreed with this plan, and they both laughed, and the frontier went on being itself around them, vast and real and full of things not yet named. The years that followed were full in the way of lives that have found their proper shape. Lucy published a total of 14 monographs in the next decade, each under her full name, each contributing to a record that would outlast the territory itself as it eventually became a state. She trained 2 younger women, who came to Colton Ridge specifically to learn from her, in the methods of field natural science, and sent them out with their specimen presses and their notebooks into a country that was, if not exactly prepared for them, at least no longer able to pretend such work could not be done by such people. Theodore served as Marshal for 11 more years, until the territory became Wyoming State in 1890, at which point the formal structures of law enforcement changed enough that he transitioned into a different kind of work, advising on land disputes and the increasingly complicated boundaries between the human and natural landscape of the plains. He was, by this point, as knowledgeable about the botanical features of the territory as any layperson in the state, which was a direct result of 15 years of riding with his wife. James grew up the way children raised by extraordinary people grow up, with a specific gravity about who he was and what the world could be made to contain. He developed his mother's methodical intelligence and his father's patience with difficulty, which was a useful combination. He had, by the time he was 12, pressed and cataloged more specimens than many adults, and had opinions about the taxonomy of native grasses that he was not shy about. When James was 8, Lucy had a daughter, whom they named Edith Margaret Keene, Edith for Lucy's grandmother, who had been the first person to give her a magnifying glass and suggest that looking closely at things was a worthy way to spend one's life, and Margaret because Theodore had a particular fondness for the sound of it. Edith arrived in the world with her mother's dark eyes and her father's complete composure, and an additional quality entirely her own, which was an apparently infinite capacity for laughter. Their house at the east end of the main street grew, in small stages, over those years. A proper study for Lucy, with good light from the east window and enough shelving to hold the increasing weight of her work. A larger kitchen, because Theodore had developed a real aptitude for cooking over the years and found the small original kitchen insufficient for his ambitions. A room for James and, later, a separate room for Edith, who made clear at age 3 that she had views about shared accommodations. Colton Ridge itself changed around them, as frontier towns change, growing in some ways and contracting in others, losing some of the roughness of its earliest years and gaining something more settled in its place. New families came and established themselves. The school grew large enough to require a second teacher. The newspaper expanded to twice weekly, and Lucy contributed to it regularly. Not just botanical articles, but pieces about the broader landscape, the political and ecological and human geography of a place becoming a state, becoming history, becoming something different from what it had been. She walked the main street on a morning in the autumn of 1892, 10 years after the night she had stood in the surgery, and refused to leave. And the street was familiar in the way of things that have become part of you, the smell of the bakery in the morning air, and the sound of the livery 2 streets over, and the particular way the light came down between the buildings at this time of year, gold and specific. She had a list of errands and a notebook under her arm, and a new specimen in the pocket of her coat that she had found on her morning walk, something interesting at the base of the ridge east of town that she wanted to look at more carefully. She ran into Theodore at the post office, where he was collecting a letter from the state capital that looked official and slightly tedious. He held the door for her with the domestic ease of 10 years, took the notebook from under her arm so she could dig through her bag for the key to their post box, and stood there reading the first line of his letter with the expression that meant it was indeed tedious. "Walk back with me," she said, when she had collected her own considerable pile of correspondence. "Yes," he said, and they went out into the morning together. They walked the length of the main street, exchanging the relevant contents of their respective correspondence, planning the week, noting the things that needed attending to and the things that could wait, and all of this was conversation that sounded like logistics and was also underneath a continuous exchange of love in the particular language of 2 people who have built a life together and know its every room. At the corner near the hardware store, Lucy stopped. "What is it?" Theodore said. She was looking up at the building. The hardware store owner's wife had planted something in the window boxes this fall, a small trailing plant with dark green leaves that Lucy recognized immediately. "She has planted Ajuga reptans in those window boxes," Lucy said. "Is that good or bad?" Theodore said. "It is completely harmless," Lucy said. "I just find it interesting. It was not here before." "Things change," Theodore said. "They do," she agreed. She stood for another moment, looking at the window boxes, and then she put her hand in her husband's and they walked the rest of the way home in the autumn morning light, the territory golden around them, their children inside waiting for breakfast, the whole shape of their life solid and real and continuing, the way all good things do, forward into time. She published her final monograph on the water hemlock that year, a comprehensive 10-year retrospective on the plant's distribution, toxicology, and treatment, incorporating everything she had learned and observed since the first night she had pressed that specimen between wax paper and marked it with a double red line. It was the most complete document on the subject in the scientific literature. The dedication read, "For TK, who opened his eyes and said do whatever she says, and for JBFK and EMK, who are the best specimens we have produced." Theodore read the dedication and was very quiet for a moment, and then he said with the particular warmth that was his deepest register, "The best work either of us has done." "Agreed," she said. Outside, the Wyoming territory stretched in every direction, enormous and full of things not yet named, and Lucy Garrison Keene had 40 more years of work ahead of her, and a husband who would ride beside her for all of them, and children who would carry forward everything she had found and everything she had built, into a future the frontier was only beginning to become. She put the monograph in its envelope, addressed it in her clear, careful hand, and went outside to mail it in the morning light.